the carpet and everything. Thank you so much. Hi everybody, good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for inviting me. As you know, I'm Nidhi Goyal and I'm blind, but so is love, so maybe you should get over it. This is usually how I start a stand-up comedy set, particularly in mainstream comedy clubs. Because the audience sitting there freezes with shock and surprise and a range of emotions in between, saying, oh my God, she's disabled and she's laughing. But why is this surprise? Because somehow we have this notion around people with disabilities. We think that they're not individuals first, they're really either inspiring memes or they're these depressed individuals, right? And the problem with that is that we somehow think that they're either superhumans or less than human beings. Basically, not quote unquote normal. Someone who we don't have to engage with, someone who's that other. What happens when you treat people with disabilities as this other is that questions begin to flow. How, what, or that happens. So what happened once was I was at a clinic, I'd cracked my ribs and I was waiting for scans and x-rays to happen, and the receptionist thought that I was in tremendous pain, so she started having a polite conversation with me. And in the middle of the conversation she said, oh, how did this happen? And I was really frustrated with myself. I said, you know, I just wasn't paying attention and I fell, and she stopped me. She said, I'm not talking about your ribs, I'm talking about your eyes. So how did this happen? The curiosity, the questions. This is an environment that every person with a disability learns to grow up with. So let's sort of counter some of the curiosities that you may be bubbling with, maybe. Yes, I'm blind, but I can eat food myself because I don't think you also need a mirror to spot your mouths. I'm blind, but I do watch films and I do dream at night. Of course, I'm blind, but my disability is not contagious. It's not, I'm not disabled because my family was cursed or that my mother forgot to remedy the evil eye that an aunt would have cast on our family or on me, right? And let me tell you, the presumed misfortune that surrounds a person with a disability will not come to you by association. But my life before 15 was not fraught with curiosities, was not fraught with questions. Because who was I before then? I was a non-disabled kid. I was as regular as kids can ever be. Naughty, jumping around, chattering, chatting, etc., etc. I was, at 4 I was learning, I was training myself in classical dance, I was training myself to paint. At 6 I was training myself to swim. At 14 I knew that I had invested 10 years of my life in becoming a portrait painter. And at 15 I was diagnosed with an incurable, irreversible eye disorder, which would probably render me blind. What happened then? Because people are like, oh, when you got this news, this must have been the most traumatic thing of your life. And I said, no. Because I, as a 15-year-old, with all the confusions that go around in teenage anyway, could hardly fathom what a life with blindness would mean. Sure, I knew one thing, that there will be major changes, maybe unpleasant, but also that my brushes wouldn't be my best friends anymore. What happened then? In all low moments, you turn to philosophy, to these positive statements that everybody gives us. So the statement that I stuck to was, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. But the only difference was that it wasn't a mere positive statement. My family was a living manifestation of this light. So the light for me was a reality. I have amazingly supportive parents, a very loving and caring sister, a brother who's awesome, living his successful life with a blindness. So here was a family, an avatar of that light, that hope at the end of the tunnel, a reality for me. But that didn't mean that I didn't have to scrape through the darkness. I sometimes bled, I sometimes was depressed, anxious, confused, and the range of things. So one of the days when I was sitting there thinking, why me, what do I do? My spiritual master, Sri Guru Balaji Tambe, he sat across me and he said, Nidhi, don't think, why me? Look at yourself. You have a family who loves you and who gives you unflinching support. Go beyond yourself. Look at other women with disabilities and you'll know what you need to do in life. I think that was the day that I got really, really conscious of my privilege. And I took an oath that I would create this support that I was fortunate enough to have for other women with disabilities like me. Sure, but when I started this life with blindness, I also felt very fortunate because I had experiences that any of you as non-disabled people would not have. And I'm going to share some of them here. The first learning or experience was that disability gives you stardom. You want to know how? When I walk into the room, everybody starts looking at me. When I walk into a restaurant, stares and whispers follow. When I walk into a cinema hall, people forget that Shah Rukh Khan's dancing on the screen. The other thing that I learned about disability was that disability is mutually exclusive with everything else. So this auntie walks up to me at a wedding, which has happened many a times, not my wedding, somebody else's, and she says, "Beta, my dear baby, you're so beautiful, you're still blind." The third thing that I learned was that the minute you can't see, people are sure that you can't speak and you can't hear. So as soon as I walk in a room with someone, the conversations flow in that direction. I remember recently my colleague was traveling with me and somebody in a restaurant said, "Madam, what will madam have? Will you please tell us?" She got irritated and she said, "Madam's tummy, madam's mouth, please ask her." But the very important thing I learned about myself as a disabled person was that I'm very lazy. And I am not cured because I'm lazy enough not to find a cure. Because everybody in this world knows about your disability and the probable cures better than you. The most interesting experiences were the experiences of my family. And I'll share one of them here, just one. My father, when I was diagnosed at 15 with an incurable irreversible eye disorder, was told by his very educated practicing doctor friend, that listen, wait for 3 years, hide her disability, let her become legal, get her married. Otherwise, she will remain unmarried and a burden on you for all the rest of her life. My father turned around and said, "Sure, thank you. I am not hiding her disability. It's not a shame. Marriage is not the only goal for my daughters. And what I need to do now is not do all of this. I need to empower her. I need to be her support while she finds or rediscovers independence and joy in a life with blindness." But why did the doctor feel that I wouldn't get married? Why would women with disabilities not get married? Because somehow women with disabilities are not considered women enough, you know, in a culture, in a context, where for us, women still are fighting these images of being the correct woman, the right woman, the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the good, everything in quotes, the good mother, the good wife, the good girl, the good daughter. Women with disabilities are assumed to be just seekers of care. You know, they can never be nurturers, they can never be carers. And they're of course supposed to comply with all these gendered roles, which presumably they won't. And so they can't get married. That really gave me a direction, just this one experience. So armed with a post-graduation in mass media, refusing to work with mainstream media organizations, I dived into into the world of activism. And I decided to work, as my goal was, for the betterment of girls and women with disabilities, to really work on their sexual and reproductive health and rights. I actually, to confess, didn't know then what working on sexuality and sexual rights would mean in this society. For me, in my head, I was exposed to sexuality at the age of 9 at a cousin's wedding, when, you know, people were giggling around all these wedding songs which have not so subtle innuendos about lovemaking and bedroom and night and etc. etc. So for me, sexuality was that simple. But apparently attraction, sexuality, sexual rights are not so simple in society. And I learned it the hard way. There was a lot of backlash, there was venom directed towards me. And the questions always were, why sexuality? There is education, there's employment, there's accessibility, and they're so important. Why sexuality? And this is what I was faced with when I started my journey as an activist in 2011. Sure, I thought things will change over a period of time. You know, there'll be more awareness, which there may be. But even in 2015, when the film Margarita with a Straw was released, it was about a girl, a young girl with cerebral palsy who talks about her love, her desires, her sexuality. And I remember a TV actress then stood up and said, listen, this is not important for people with disabilities. You know, if they have 10 things on their mind, sex would be the 10th. And that's when I realized that we have this superpower to turn ordinary film TV actresses into mind readers. Because how else would she know what we want? Yeah? Why would someone force us to choose between education and sexuality, between employment and sexuality? Who's someone else to speak on our behalf? And that's the day I realized that women with disabilities really are silenced. They are silenced, they're invisible. And I always crack a joke that it's a privilege to be disabled, because the minute I'm disabled and this white cane's with me, people don't look at me because I can be so fat and invisible because this slim white cane is with me, right? The wheelchairs, the white canes, the hearing aids, these become the identity of the women, and they stop there. Fine. This was not the only reaction that we were grappling with as activists. I got a lot of personal comments where people said, oh, you want to feel like you're doing something, so sure, you know, this is pseudo activism. You're doing elitist activism because you're like from Mumbai and educated in English speaking. You're single and young, so of course you're desperate, and that's why you're working on sexuality. But the best one was when someone from the disability community called me and said, listen, the word is going around, very joyfully he said, the word is going around that Nidhi Goyal only knows to talk about sex. I was really offended as a young woman. I paused, I thought, and then I replied. I said, what do you guys mean by Nidhi Goyal only knows to talk about sex? What about doing it? He was stumped, he had no response to that. But it was very interesting because when I started my work, I co-researched and co-authored a website, sexualityanddisability.org, working with a Mumbai-based nonprofit Point of View. And I was very excited about the work, and I went and I shared it with my friends. I said, you know, this is a website, we're talking to girls and women with disabilities, we're talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights, and we will soon start trainings in this area, and I would really like to take this work ahead. So I told a friend, I was like, we're talking about everything from body, acceptance, to consent, to sexuality, relationships, marriage, parenting, violence, abuse, parenting as a person with a disability. And the man turned around and said, what, did you say marriage? I said, yes. How will these disabled women get married? Are you now going to force us men to get married to them? So I turned to the next person, next friend, and I shared the same thing, the same spectrum of work, and she said, did you say parenting? How would women with disabilities be parents? What if something happens to the child? What if the child gets hurt? I said, what if your child gets hurt? And she said, but my child is very naughty, he always gets hurt. So I said, sure, your child gets hurt because he is naughty. A disabled woman's child gets hurt because she's disabled. I went to the third friend and I again shared the same thing, and she said, did you say sexuality and sex and parenting? And I said, yeah. She said, you mean these women on wheelchairs can have, can conceive? Obviously the glaring omission was, can they have sex? And that's when I realized that in India we generally say, hi, how are you, how do you do? This is our greeting. But when it comes to people with disabilities, we don't even pause to think, and we say, hi, how are you, how do you do it? And that's the line that we operate on, right? But then someone turned around and said, don't worry, we have very special arrangements for people with disabilities, and particularly women, because women with disabilities are quite frankly like quite undesirable, and I don't think they also have desires because they have to grapple with so much more, and they're undateable and unmarriageable. But there's one solution. So a burn survivor, a friend of mine who's a burn survivor, she came to me and she said, I've been advised very strongly by my neighbors that I should marry a blind man So then my quote unquote ugliness doesn't affect him. And that was the perfect solution. Because why don't we put disabled and disabled together? So then we can live in this world of the quote unquote normal. And that's what happens. It's very interesting because it forces people into a lot of situations as well. And I'll share a very little small situation here where my friend was waiting for me in a restaurant. We were meeting for a cup of coffee and he was also visually impaired. And he reached early, so he was just calling me and saying, listen, when you enter the restaurant, just walk down straight towards the end. I'm on the left corner table. And I said, wait, you don't have to tell me all this. He said, why? I said, just wait and watch. And I reached the restaurant and the security guard said, madam, sir is waiting for you since when? Come, 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 I'll take you to him. As if a visually impaired person can go have coffee only with another visually impaired person, right? You know, I often say that disability doesn't stop us from having experiences, from living a full life. What does is the environment. What stops us is the attitude of the people around us. Sure, you know, we can take it, tolerate it, bear it to a level, but ignorance, quite frankly, ceases to be an excuse. Curiosity becomes irritating, and help against my choice is absolutely not welcome. And if you still do all this, the joke is on you. With this idea, I started to perform stand-up comedy to create sensitization around disability, gender and sexuality and related issues, and became India's first ever disabled female comedian as of today. What did this to me, did to me was I took my activism and comedy combined and worked on creating awareness, on changing attitudes, on bettering the lives of girls and women with disabilities. There were struggles, there were successes, there were a variety of tools. There was trainings, research, writing, campaigns that I engaged in with a range of human rights and women's rights organizations that I work. But for me, what was really important was to take that vision of the 15-year-old girl who'd acquired blindness, to take that vision ahead of creating a support for women with disabilities. With this vision in mind, I recently launched my organization, Rising Flame, just with one thought, that women with disabilities need to build their voice, that they need to become leaders and embody the change, because we need a change for women with disabilities to be recognized as women, to be recognized as human beings, and we don't just need one change, we need waves of it. Thank you very much.